There we go.
Alright, object fiat. We kind of discussed this a second ago with the no war kind of counterplan. But object fiat is basically when you kind of fiat away the affirmative's harms to a certain extent. So, for example, if the affirmative reads an advantage that says like it ends in China war or something like that, there's an argument to be made that you cannot. Well, object fiat would be counterplan China don't go to war. That's a little bit unfair because obviously like, you're just fiating that China doesn't take an action that they would reasonably take or possibly take. It's kind of fair. There's a different interpretation also that says that you get to maybe fiat certain elements of the advantage. Like if the advantage says that, suppose you read a plan that somehow like high-speed rail is crucial to Obama developing national missile defense. And if we deploy national missile defense, then that's really what's critical to checking ourselves. Sorry, it should go the other way. It says without high-speed rail, we'll deploy national missile defense. National missile defense is really bad. You can counterplan to have the United States not deploy national missile defense. That's an argument for what could be potentially object fiat. I tend to feel that's not necessarily true. I kind of think object fiat revolves far more around what is the object of the resolution, and that's what object fiat actually is. So there's not really, I think, a good example of object fiat that might have happened on this topic, because obviously, because the United States federal government is the actor, you can probably always fiat the U.S. federal government. But it'd be something a little bit different. For example, a few years ago, the topic in college was that the United States federal government should increase pressure on China. And there was an argument to be made that basically if you read a counterplan that had China take any particular action, then that was an example of object fiat. Because like if you said like China don't go to war, or China stop like, running sweatshops or something like that, that would be an example of object fiat. Because you're fiating what is the object of the resolution, i.e. China. So object fiat can be bad for a lot of different reasons. Basically, the best one is that you basically fiat away the affirmative's harms. Like they're like Chinese sweatshops are really, really bad for a bunch of reasons. And you stand up and say counterplan, China, no more sweatshops. Now here's my disadvantage to you pressuring China to end sweatshops. You kind of see how that works? It's like that. How could you ever win if you're after? You basically said your advantage doesn't exist, but I read a diss ad to the one thing you're after, which is pressure China. It's like that's not fair at all. Object fiat, however, can be good. Usually not in that instance when it's on the resolution, but object fiat such as like don't deploy NMD, like that's not part of the plan text. That's not part of the resolution. So it's kind of legitimate that you get to say like counterplan not to counterplan not to deploy a national missile defense. What does the affirmative get to do in that world? They can impact turn it, that's right. They can read arguments as to why national missile defense is good. So, there's definitely offense that you can generate based off of, any sort of what's based. Usually object fiat happens when you counterplan out of an advantage. And there's offense that you can generate when you counterplan out of an advantage like that. Or you can try to. It gets a little tricky. That's how it kind of functions. There's no such ideas to fiat. Private actor fiat. We already kind of touched on this a little bit, but this is kind of like what public-private partnership counterplans are going to be on this topic, but basically it's how private actors do the plan or do something very similar to the plan. There's a lot of arguments where it's like if the app just needs to be a blank check, you can have a billionaire like Bill Gates write a blank check to like fund a bunch of infrastructure projects or something. That would be an example of a private actor counterplan. Picking different companies to basically cooperate and build an infrastructure project, that would be an example of a private actor counterplan. Usually the objections to them fall into that category of multi-actor fiat, and also that there's no literature for them, because there's hardly anybody who really writes about what a couple different corporations should do to solve all our transportation infrastructure projects. And if there's no literature on it, then how could you ever research it, prepare for it, and then who writes answers to it? So that means that you've now read a counterplan, which I couldn't be prepared for, which is not predictable, and which there's no literature on, so I couldn't research. So how am I supposed to beat that argument? You're literally just pulling stuff out of your head. It's the definition of claim without warrant. Or warrant data. You need to have evidence to support your argument, otherwise you're not making an argument, you're just making crap up. Arguably it's also utopian. Different companies won't just magically decide to work together, or bummers won't, or different people won't decide just to to work together like Bill Gates just don't. I mean, he writes a lot of big checks, but it's not like he's just going to suddenly fund every sort of project. They're usually the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has particular things that they tend to focus on. And it's not necessarily transportation infrastructure. Alright. That's kind of the nuts and bolts on fiat. I want to talk to you about a couple of more that are a little bit different. They revolve around the question of fiat because they're going to discuss the issue of time. The first one is the delay counterplan. What would be an example of the delay counterplan? Part 2.
Do the affirmative after the election.
That's right. It's basically 100% of the plan, but done after some particular date. Elections are usually a great example of this. Every year there's an election, there's almost always a delay counterplay, right? Because it just makes sense. Whatever you're going to do on the app, most assuredly, is probably the key thing that will determine the election for whatever stupid reason people find cards for. And so that's an idea just to basically say, we'll do the app in 3 months or 6 months after the election. This can also work with agenda-based disads. Like if you have a card that says there's going to be a vote coming up on a bill relatively soon, and you want to read your politics distat based on that, you can say delay the plan until after the passage of this bill. Make sense? Delay counterplan? What does the delay counterplan do to fiat? You said it. I think you might have said it.
Stops it.
What?
Stops it.
Well, it doesn't necessarily stops it is right, but it kind of starts it again. And when does it start it again?
After.
Later. It starts it in the future. So one of the most common objections to delay counterplan is that it's future fiat. What's the problem with fiating that stuff happens 6 months from now? And it's just assuming that and writing and trying to write arguments saying that this is why you should vote for our app because we do something 6 months from now. Anyone? Let me ask you this. How are you going to research on what the world looks like in 6 months? You're not. Our newspapers aren't written. You know? This isn't like some crazy new guy. We don't know what's happening in 6 months. I can't cut disads to that in 6 months. However, there's a decent chance that you can now get out of a lot of different arguments that I would read against your counterplay because you said do it in the future. And that's the reason why future fiat is oftentimes considered illegitimate in a lot of different ways. Delay counterplans are bad because they steal the after out. We'll talk a little bit more about plan-inclusive counterplans and why they might be illegitimate in a second here, or in a little while here. But this is basically like the argument. You've told 100% of my affirmative, and you did it literally without even removing something that I can read at a complete advantage to. You just basically did it, and then said, now you have to prove that you have some argument why this had to be done today as opposed to in 2 months. It's like, well, that's not necessarily fair if you have to jack my entire affirmative and, basically delay it a few days. You don't get to weigh your app in the same way because they basically do all of the affirmative. Now you're just stuck to waiting some minuscule time frame distinction on that, which is completely unfair. There's usually no literature for these arguments that says that we should delay doing a transportation infrastructure project until after the election. That's a serious problem. That argument's just stupid, Bob. You know, plagiarism, not stupid. Implant reglass said they can delay the plan by 2 seconds. Suppose they want to say do the plan by 2 seconds, and that allows us to save a penny on the project. A penny saved is a penny earned. That's our net benefit. It's comparatively advantageous. I saved us a penny. That's better than the app. We literally did everything the app did. We just saved a penny. It sucks to be you. You know? That's a reason as to why it kind of gets to unfair. So I know that politics, it makes a lot of sense to delay the do that with delay counterplan with. But what the theory behind the delay counterplan justifies is ultimately really trivial, minuscule net benefits that make no sense. But since they literally stole 100% of the affirmative, what are you going to do? And what's the disad to saving a penny? I don't know. There's a... the other thing, and probably one of the better arguments... Oh yeah, your question.
What about arguing that it doesn't cause any clash in the debate round because it's just you're doing the exact same thing?
Yeah, that's it. It kind of moots the education, moots topic-specific education. It's a form of intellectual plagiarism, honestly. We're not really having a debate. Now we're just having a debate over something that's not relevant to the topic. That's kind of unfair, and that's illegitimate. It's a poor standard. It's a bad way to go about debate. It doesn't contest the affirmative, because the affirmative just had to answer the resolution as being true. And fundamentally, a counterplan that is basically a delay counterplan also answers the resolution as being true. It just does it the exact same way. It literally does the exact same thing the app does. So it's not a reason that really tests the competitive, it's not a competitive test of the affirmative. Alright. Why delay counterplans are good. Here's a text I wrote up in 08 for a practice debate that I did. Delay until after the general elections. Keep testing the opportunity cost of the app. If you do it now, it will disrupt the election. I read cards that said doing your app today is bad. I said do your app in 2 months. That's good. I tested whether or not we should do the app right now. I'm not really sure what the problem is. It's still a test of this. It's still the same sort of test. It's predictable. Delays in controversial legislation happen all the time until after elections. People are smart. Obama right now, basically everything he's doing is to help himself with the election. such as changing, our procedures for prosecuting people that are illegal immigrants, while at the same time arguing to extend the parts of the Bush tax cut. That's called pandering to different parts of the political spectrum. Do you think there's any way, shape, or form any politician right now is doing anything without thinking about how it's going to impact the election? Just makes sense. Solvency and advantages, check abuse. Look, if you're so smart and you need to do it right now, why don't you have a reason why we need to do it right now? Where's your time? Where's your disadvantage of delaying any day? It still disproves the resolution. The word "should" the resolution is that it's time. It proves that it's time bound. And this is part of the argument with the delay counterplan I didn't really talk about. Fiat usually needs to be interpreted, or the most fair way to interpret it is that "should" means immediate, that it has to happen today. And there are other ways to interpret fiat that it might happen in the future. But the way, especially if you're negative, you want to argue is that it needs to happen right now. Once again, for the same sort of arguments we talked about. We can't research in the future. So the negative saying that basically it's completely real world, and it said it disproves the resolution because the resolution said should, which means do it now. We said do it later. So most real world, now is the key time. Legislative actions this happens all the time when we delay stuff. Counter interpretations, what I built in here says delay counterplans are legitimate in the context of elections specifically. So that means that when people say, oh, this leads to the counterplan just to delay for like a second and save a penny, I can say, no, that's not what our interpretation would allow. We say you can only delay in the context of an election because that makes the most sense. It's just defense of the status quo. This argument's a little, wanky, but it basically says we're defending, keep the status quo as it is for a couple more months. You have to be able to defend why the plan is desirable now. Just running the net benefit doesn't check the abuse. I can't just read my politics dissent. Because you read an affirmative that is so big, I can never possibly outweigh it with just a politics dissent. I need to have a counterplan and to keep this debate fair and competitive. Key to negative ground. If the appetite gets to sever the immediacy of the plan, that destroys all negative ground. We're going to talk about that. You can always turn the politics dissent. That's your offense. You don't need to have offense while your plan has to be done now. You just have to beat the politics dissent. Here's the thing that I went out and did that was really smooth for these kids. Was I cut cards that literally said that Congress people delay stuff all the time. What have I preached to you so far about literature? Say it, I'm going to flog all of you. What? Just kidding, everybody at home watching. Seriously, what did I just say? What is the only way to determine what is a fair argument in debate? If there's a literature base on there. I've got cards that say that in September 2002, at a meeting with President Bush and Vice President Dick Cheney, pressed congressional leaders to for a quick vote on a resolution authorizing military action against Iraq. Dash asked Bush to delay the vote until after the impending midterm elections. In other words, people delay actions all the time before elections. Here's a different example. Lawmakers yesterday delayed a vote on a proposed constitutional amendment to outlaw same-sex marriage until after the November election. UPI 2004. Year-long efforts to approve various high-profile measures are expected to fall on the back burner. Lawmakers will leave a host of unfinished bills located with the highest profile of these as competing legislation pending in both the House and Senate to reform the national intelligence system. However, the delays are motivated by politics than legislative concerns, as Democrats push for votes on the issues and the means to reach out to voters. Although, to deny that they are looking to decide some difficult issues that cause division within their own party just before the election, Democrats dismiss this as preposterous. People do this all the time. I have literature that says in the context of elections, people delay controversial decisions. How could you not see this coming? Once again, even if my theory arguments aren't great, I got cards to back it up. If you have no cards to say that people don't delay stuff until after the elections, you're probably going to lose this debate. Question?
What if the app is just really delayed in itself? Like a lot of the space apps last year, it would take years and years and years to build and...
Well, this is an interesting part of the debate. Because they announced, every DISAD link will probably be based on, you announced it now, that means that it's passed immediately, and it's an up yes, and down no vote, they authorize the funding for it now. So that's how we get all our DISAD links, basically. You're right, some of the other DISAD links might take a little bit longer until the plan's actually done, but then that would arguably, be a result of solvency of the affirmative, which case, that's just kind of how that works. But a lot of times most DISAD links are triggered immediately, or at least the name will try and say are triggered immediately. Yeah, question?
Can an app run a delayed app file?
Well, they can't. Remember, this is debate, and you can do anything you want. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not responding to you. Because people can't stop fighting. Yes, question. I'll answer that question in a second, because I'm about to get to a different question about bottom of the docket. That's kind of key thing. Yes?
How would you perm a delay counterplan?
Perm do the counterplan.
But your plan is do it now, they say do it later.
That's why we didn't say permutation do both. We said permutation do the counterplan. The argument is that the counterplan is not different from the app. therefore it's not competitive, so we should just do the counterplan. It's not competitive, there's no difference, you can vote for the act.
We have a different interpretation of should. Should doesn't mean immediate. Should just means that it should be done at some point, relatively soon, within the prediction of the literature base. Doesn't mean it has to be done today. It has to be done, in a few months. That's just kind of how it works. That's probably more like the normal means policy-making process. How often does a piece of legislation get proposed, passed, and, authorized and put into action all in the same day? Doesn't. In terms of delaying for the affirmative, the reason why you arguably shouldn't delay as the affirmative is that there's really good arguments, I think, as as the negative, is that you can say that means I get no disad links. There's no bright line or predictable limit on this argument, because at any point you can basically say the app happens after my disad links. And I can't research it, which is horribly unfair, but more importantly, you can basically spike out every argument I made in the debate. It's totally unfair. So, make sense? We all kind of cool on that? You gotta read cards. That's the most important thing I'd like to at least teach you, is that you can cut cards for theory arguments. And you don't have to be cards out of theory books like Roger Stoltz's handbook or anything like that. You can cut cards about how real world practices operate and use those to justify your arguments and why your arguments are theoretically legitimate. This should hopefully dovetail with whatever solvency cards you have, i.e. like a multi-actor fiat counterplan. You should hopefully have a card that says that's legit, but it also works for other things like delay a few days. Cool? Make sense? Alright. Let's see what else. Alright, I don't deal with console yet, so let's talk about what we were saying a second ago. What's a way in which the affirmative can maybe get out of politics links? This kind of also is an interesting interpretation of how fiat works. Anyone ever heard of the argument of bottom of the docket? Alright, what did I just say a second ago? How does policy making work? Does a bill immediately get proposed, passed, and implemented all the same day? No, that's right. Bills take time to get written. They get put into committees. Committees mark them up. They reconcile different committee versions of the bill. They come out of the committees. There are fights and speeches on the floors of both the Senate and the House. The President probably makes speeches either support or against it. Eventually, the two bills are signed. They are then reconciled. If there are any discrepancies, it's sent to the President. The President then signs it, and then it gets implemented into law. Usually after it gets turned over to an agency, who then has to figure out all the different ways to implement it. This can take years. So part of the argument is that when you say your politics link, like politics, you do the plan, and then you say you do the plan, that leads to Obama losing all the political capital. Your argument can be no link. Our interpretation of fiat is that the plan would go to the bottom of the docket. It would be one of the last things voted on. There are other things that are maybe more controversial ahead of it that would trigger your disad link, and it won't be relevant to the affirmative. It's an argument as to why basically politics arguments really aren't generic or aren't germane to how affirmatives work. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, plans wouldn't happen like that. Alright, so the reasons are kind of up there. Why do you think this would be cheating? That has to do with the same thing we just talked about a second ago. What did we just talk about a second ago? Time travel back in your brains. Time travel. Hey-oh, that's right. It all comes together. It's like John Circle and Back to the Future. Well, do you think it's future fiat, maybe? Possibly. There's an argument to be said that you basically have now functionally delayed your plan for months or years, and our argument implementation and when it happens occurs way well into the future. So it could be future fiat. It severs the immediacy of the affirmative. Once again, how am I supposed to get disad links if you're talking about a plan that might take years to get through Congress or committee? Completely unfair. It also isn't real world to a certain extent, because the reason why a bill goes through Congress for so long is that they fight over it. There's a risk that it might not get passed. So basically you're fiating that you want the advantage of a big fight over a controversial piece of legislation, but you don't want to have to deal with any of the consequences of that fight over a piece of legislation. You just want to assume that it eventually will happen. And so that's why it's not real world to say it's bottom of the docket. And I know that it might not be in best practice to say that a plan happens immediately, the day that you say vote out, the day you sign the ballot. But honestly, in terms of our little game, in terms of our little game that we're playing right here, and in terms of the research we're able to do for debates, it's far more fair to the negative and ensures competitive equity in the round if we assume the bill is passed today, that it's done today, and implementation happens today. That's what's key to all our disad links, our counterplaying ground, and our critiques. What's an argument that even if they win, that the plan is at the bottom of the docket, why it would still link to the politics disad? Anybody? said, we're going to do the plan, we're going to start it off in the congressional committees and work its way up there. The key word there is they said, somebody please use your brain, get the hamster on the wheel. Do you think that anytime a piece of legislation starts being introduced to Congress, that there's maybe like a speech to introduce it? Think like maybe the press corps like follows what legislation is going through Congress and who's supporting it and not supporting it?
Yeah.
That means the plan, even though it may not be done and implemented and passed by Congress for months or years, is announced today. That Obama starts losing political capital today. That the GOP starts spinning the plan as a reason to vote against Obama today. So basically that there's a signal argument. That no matter what happens, even if the app wins, that they're arguing that it doesn't have to be implemented for quite a while, that the signal alone today is bad enough. That is enough to trigger the link to the dissent. Cool? Kind of makes sense? There's also other arguments that, like, especially on political capital disads, that even if it means that like the legislation will take a long time to like get passed through Congress, or at the bottom of the docket, that Obama will have to be spending political capital the whole time. Your politics file should have, your agenda politics file should have your cards that say that it costs political capital. That things crowd out. That if Obama introduces a piece of legislation today, it might crowd out other things he wants to focus on over the next like few months or few weeks. And so there's an argument that even if it's at the bottom of the docket, that because it's introduced right now, that it'll crowd out all the other stuff that was above it. Possible. At least it's an argument. So, like I said, cut cards and do research for theory. Alright. We're talking about a few other fiat-related counterplans. What's a consultation counterplan? Consult another country, consult another actor, basically consult somebody. It's kind of picking out of the immediacy of the affirmative. The affirmative said, we're going to do the plan right now. The counterplan says, don't do the plan right now, go talk to somebody else, usually get their approval for the counterplan, or for the plan, and then once they give their approval, implement it. Make sense? Do you think that's fair? Why not? Yes, no, maybe? Give me an opinion, or I'll yell at you. I mean, you know, they said they picked out the immediacy, you know. Alright, what would you be looking for if somebody read this counterplan against you?
Whatever
Literature.
country they say.
That's right. What were you going to say here?
What other country they say, they will say no.
That's true. That's a good argument. Alright, so we have two pretty good arguments right here. One is there literature? A lot of times, you know, Consult Japan has been people's like go-to consultation counterplay, and even on questions where Japan clearly doesn't care about being consulted. They're just like, you know, Consult Japan about transportation. Counterplay, boom. The net benefit is the fact that it helps our, you know, the Japanese military alliance. You know, for some reason. Why not? Only risk of offense, you didn't consult, they might get mad, so therefore we solve. So you want to look for literature, the places are right there. And Eric had the other good question. When you consult somebody, there's the risk that they could say no. But Japan doesn't like the idea of us spending a bunch of money to build up our own infrastructure. They probably would like Japanese companies to be involved in that process. So they might say no to the way the affirmative is drafted. What's an interpretation, do you think, that relates to fiat that might make this counterclaim not competitive? If I read cards that said, like, oh, well, Japanese companies are going to be involved in building our high-speed rail line, and I just said the United States government will build high-speed rail, what would be an argument you'd want to try and make in the QAC related to fiat? The answer is yes.
Normal means.
Yes, it's normal means. That basically when we said do high-speed rail, we all knew that it was going to have the Japanese companies involved, and more than likely we were going to have to talk to Japan in order to make sure that those companies could come work here. So that's a reason why permutation do the counterplan, or you can make, there are different ways to phrase it. Permutation, you know, do the plan and consult with Japan. But all those arguments are basically just normal means. You probably say permutation, do the counterplan, normal means is consultation. But that's an argument that you can use, and that's kind of a different interpretation of fiat. Because it's basically saying not just we would do it, but we do it as part of the normal means process of doing it would require us to consult. It's a really good permutation for you to have, because if you can win that argument, the counterplan goes away. aggressive. The other arguments or problems with consultation counterplans is that basically you can consult anybody about anything. It's not usually germane to the topic. It's not germane to, like, it's not testing the affirmative. Like, whether or not some random country wants a yes-no vote doesn't really test whether or not the United States federal government should do something. You know what I'm saying? Like, just because the consultation process would boost the American-Japanese alliance doesn't mean that the app happening alone hurts the American-Japanese alliance. So it didn't really test the nature of the affirmative or whether or not the affirmative should be done. It created an artificial net benefit. And that's the phrase you probably want to write down right here. Is that consultation counterplans usually create artificial net benefits that allow for competition. That just basically means that it's not a disadd to the affirmative happening that the counterplan avoids, but a net benefit to the counterplan happening alone. And that's why consultation counterplans are arguably illegitimate. Alright, consultations are good. Infinite regression is inevitable. That's kind of a good answer to any sort of argument. It's like, you know, yeah, you can always say that there are too many people, there are too many different ways we can do actors, there are two different things that can happen. It is predictable. If you're going to read a consult counterplan, have some evidence on it, please. And then you kind of see the similar theme that's running through here. It's not that bad. Stop whining if you're asked. We've got cards. Now you have to have cards to back this up, and usually there's evidence out there, but you should have cards. Depending on the topic, it could be predictable. I think on this topic, for certain projects, particularly like the Bering Strait app, I mean, you know, consult with Russia. You know, like part of the problem with the app is its solvency mechanism kind of just assumes that Russia will definitely build that part of the tunnel. However, obviously, making sure that both parts of the project are completely in sync in terms of the technology they're going to use, making sure the rail lines link up, you know, probably we should talk to them. We should probably also maybe talk to China, maybe to Japan. Those are all different countries that would be highly interested in this process. So it could be relevant to the topic. Let's see what else we can do. Yeah, I kind of like that. That's good. What are conditions counterplans? Largely related. Condition counterplan, part 2.
It depends on something happening.
Yeah, condition counterplan is don't do the app now, have somebody else do something in exchange for us doing the app. So, for example, Russia would probably really like to see us build as part of the Bering Strait tunnel, since they've already dedicated like $65 billion to doing it. So rather than give up the leverage of them wanting us to build the tunnel, we should say, okay, Russia, we'll build the tunnel if you say, like, you know, dismantle all your nuclear weapons. Or something that, like, you have to have obviously evidence for, but that would be something that will give you like a net benefit that works. Like a few years ago, there was a great piece of evidence on the Middle East topic that we cut that said, like, rather than just do the plan, which would have, like, you know, have the United States federal government, it was sort of on ag? No, it was on like the nuclear weapons topic. We had a card that was like, the United States federal government should change like their nuclear weapons policy, and they should use that as leverage to get China to stop supporting the genocide in Darfur. It was like crazy that this card like actually existed, and someone actually linked America's nuclear weapons policy with, and it was literally like use the word quid pro quo, which means, you know, like you scratch my back, I scratch yours, sort of thing. And it said like, in order for the United States government to change their policy, the first thing they should do is condition it on the Chinese stopping or doing whatever they have to do to, like, you know, stop the slaughter in Darfur. It was awesome. And that's a good conditions counterplan. Some people will do crazy stuff where they just have like, they have a card that says Canada would like us to do this. Then they'll read another card which says we would like Canada to do this. And then they'll just say, okay, well here's our condition counterplan. We'll do this if Canada does this. They both want it, so, you know, hey, thumbs up. Yeah. Condition counterplans are arguably bad because if they don't actually mention the plan and the counterplan and whatever the condition is in the same card, obviously there's no literature on it, that's not fair. The condition committee, that's just a small thing which kind of generates an artificial or trivial net benefit, and that's not fair. There's an infinite number of conditions that can be attached. Literally, I mean, you can type in almost anything there is that exists within 100 of like another word, and you'll find those two things in the same article, or like the same web post or blog or something. So like, what is ultimately the litmus test for a piece of evidence that is a condition counterplan is kind of arbitrary. And that's why, since the counterplan can just be devastating to the affirmative, you need to hold it to a higher standard. No solvency advocate, obviously you gotta have literature. We'll skip that textual stuff. Arguably it's Plan Plus. What does Plan Plus mean? What is it? A counterplan needs to probably be different from the affirmative, right? It can't be the exact same thing as the affirmative. That's not fair. Can a counterplan just add something to the affirmative? Well, I mean, it can, but should it? Is that fair? If I literally said give $100 million to high-speed rail, and the negative counterplan was give $101 million to high-speed rail, I mean, is there any real difference between the two aside from that $1? Is there any reason why the cost of doing the affirmative trades off with the cost of doing the negative? I mean, they literally gave I already said give $100 million, they just added $1 more. The answer to this question is no. That arguably conditions counterplans are Plan Plus. They did all of the affirmative, and the only thing they added was basically this condition, which means they didn't really, like, you know, they didn't really subtract anything from the affirmative. And it's not a competitive counterplan. Now, if you're negative, that's ridiculous. The affirmative has to be immediate. The affirmative has definite implementation, right? When you fiat it. So that means that when I said, do this if X country agrees to do Y, there's always the chance the other country says no. And that's what ultimately is a kind of a test of the affirmative. We don't want to give up that leverage, but what we want to do is have the other country go ahead, and we want to be able to have, like your solvency argument is, have the other country have the ability to say no, which means the app doesn't happen. So there's a world where, yes, 100% of the affirmative happens. There's also a world where none of the app happens. And that's why these counterplans are legit. There's also other reasons, which I've kind of hit on before. You know, it's within the literature. We've got cards on it. It's totally fair. You should have been prepared for it. It's, you know, like I said, this negative gets everything that's not part of the resolution. This is not part of the resolution. Therefore, it's fair ground versus a counterplan. That's pretty much the core reasons why condition counterplans are good. Alright. 3 o'clock. What would you all like to practice? Nothing? Anything? What do you have the fear on? Well, we're going to do exactly what we did. We're going to break it into some groups. We're going to give you a theory argument. We're going to have you write out some answers. Yes?
What about the people that didn't speak out there here?
I mean, I'll decide who gets to speak and who doesn't get to speak. We'll start with voluntary basis, and when that breaks down, we'll just start calling them. If you have something you kind of like to give a speech on or work or develop on, I'm more than happy to let you pick. Otherwise, I'm just going to pick one of the random theory arguments and let you have at it.
Are you guys over like Wipeout?
Yeah, we're going to go with that. We're here till 5, man, trust me. We got oodles of time. That's why I'm trying to say Wipeout at the end, because that's clearly where we're all going to be the most tired, and that's the most fun stuff to talk about. That's why we should all die. So.
And time cube?
Huh?
And time cube?
Oh, well,
I'll discuss time cube because it's not a real debate argument.
it's not real.
Even whenever it was actually read, it was never read as a real debate argument. That's why.
Yeah. There's kind of always a joke. It's an interesting idea, but it's always a joke. Oh, what should we have to do this speech about? I don't know that. I can't really have to do something. Go back to the beginning, just have you lay out maybe this thing.
We discussed it like yes.
Oh yeah, that was the top part. We spent a lot of time on that. Actually, that might be a good one, because that's one most people might be this comfortable with. Alright. No neg fiat. They have said that there's no should not in the resolution, which means the negative doesn't get any fiat. They're saying that it destroys apparatus is unpredictable because there are infinite abnormal ways to do counterplans and critiques. It kills topics specific education and fairness. Those are the arguments you need to respond to. I'm going to try and give you 10 minutes, but clearly you're going to take a little bit more than that. So get together with some other people. If you're not really comfortable writing by yourself, you should be kind of talking, cooperating. And I want the best. I want 7 arguments at the very least that respond to this. Hopefully more if you got it. I want you to take a few minutes and respond to this, and then we'll do some speeches and kind of keep talking. Hey, yeah, you want to shut off the camera so I can start beating you?